At the hospital's exit, a desperate girl screams, "Can I pay later? Mum is dying." With only a few coins in her hands, she begs an indifferent doctor for a chance to save her mother. An elegant man, silently watching everything, relives a trauma buried for decades, and in that moment he realizes that helping that child may be his only chance to save himself. The fluorescent lights of Chicago General Hospital cast harsh shadows across the marble floor as 10-year-old Emma Rodriguez clutched a worn envelope containing every dollar she had managed to collect over the past 3 desperate months. Her small hands trembled uncontrollably as she approached the imposing reception desk, her heart pounding with desperate hope and overwhelming fear that threatened to consume her. The envelope held $1,800, money she had gathered through heartbreaking sacrifices that no child should ever have to make. Emma had sold her beloved bicycle, the one her mother Sarah had saved for months to buy her for her 9th birthday, to a neighbor for $50. Her collection of porcelain dolls, carefully accumulated over years of birthday and Christmas gifts, had been sold one by one through online marketplaces, with the help of Mrs. Patterson from apartment 3B. Most painfully, she had parted with her late grandmother's pearl necklace, the only valuable heirloom their family possessed, selling it to a pawn shop for $300, while tears streamed down her cheeks. The kind neighbors in their rundown apartment building had contributed what they could spare from their own meager resources. Mrs. Chen from the laundromat downstairs had given her $20 and a bag of homemade cookies. Mr. Thompson, the elderly veteran who lived alone at the end of their hall, had pressed a crumpled $50 bill into her small hands with tears in his eyes, telling her that her mother was a good woman who deserved to fight. Even the teenagers who usually ignored her had pooled together their allowance money, raising $47 in small bills and loose change. Behind the imposing glass barrier sat Margaret Peterson, a receptionist whose expression remained cold and unchanged as Emma cleared her throat nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman barely glanced up from her computer screen when Emma placed the crumpled envelope on the counter with shaking hands, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush as she explained her impossible situation. Her mother, Sarah Rodriguez, lay in room 314 of the oncology ward, fighting an aggressive form of acute lymphoblastic leukemia that had transformed their once bright home into a place of whispered prayers, sleepless nights, and constant fear. Emma had become an unwilling expert in medical terminology that no child should ever need to understand. She knew about white blood cell counts, chemotherapy protocols, and survival statistics with the precision of a medical student. She understood that her mother needed an experimental cellular therapy called CAR T-cell treatment that could potentially save her life, but the treatment cost $200,000, a sum that might as well have been $2 million in their world of empty refrigerators, overdue bills, and electricity that had been shut off twice in the past month. Margaret Peterson's response cut through Emma's fragile hope like a blade of ice. Hospital policy required full payment verification before any experimental treatments could begin, she explained in a monotone voice that suggested she had delivered this devastating news countless times before. $1,800 wouldn't even cover the preliminary consultations and blood work required before the actual treatment could be considered. The hospital was a business, not a charity, and they couldn't make exceptions regardless of how tragic the circumstances might be. Emma's legs gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to her knees on the cold hospital floor, her small frame shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. The bustling lobby continued around her as if nothing had happened, nurses rushing past with clipboards and medications, families hurrying to elevators with flowers and worried expressions, visitors checking in for appointments that seemed routine and manageable compared to her nightmare. Through her tears, Emma began to plead with anyone who would listen, her voice growing louder and more desperate with each word. She spoke of her mother's kindness, how Sarah would give her last dollar to help a stranger, how she worked 16-hour days as a seamstress to keep their small apartment and put food on their table. She described how her mother had collapsed at work 3 months ago, how the diagnosis had shattered their already fragile world, how they had no family nearby to help them navigate this medical and financial catastrophe. From across the spacious lobby, a man in an expensive, charcoal grey suit, watched the scene unfold with growing unease that he couldn't quite explain or dismiss. Michael Harrison had come to Chicago General for what should have been a routine quarterly meeting with the hospital's board of directors, discussing potential investment opportunities in new medical technologies. At 42, Michael had built a financial empire worth over $50 million through calculated decisions, emotional detachment, and an unwavering focus on profit margins that had served him well in the ruthless world of corporate finance. Something about the small figure collapsed on the floor made him pause in his determined stride toward the executive elevators, stirring emotions deep within him that he had spent 3 decades trying to suppress and forget. The child's desperate cries echoed through the marble corridors, carrying a pain that resonated in parts of his heart he had thought were permanently closed off from the world. Michael's own childhood had been marked by similar desperation and helplessness. 32 years ago, he had been exactly Emma's age, sitting in a different hospital corridor in Detroit, begging doctors to save his mother Elena from the cancer that was slowly destroying her body and their dreams of a future together. But unlike this brave little girl, he had failed completely, watching his mother fade away while social workers made plans for his future in foster care. He approached slowly, his Italian leather shoes silent against the polished marble as he knelt beside Emma, his expensive suit jacket pooling on the floor around him. His voice was gentle but cautious as he asked what was wrong, and through her tears and broken sobs, Emma poured out her story with an honesty and desperation that cut straight through his carefully constructed emotional barriers. She spoke of sleepless nights spent researching experimental treatments on the public library computers, printing out medical articles she barely understood, but studied with the intensity of a doctoral student. She described watching her mother grow weaker each day, seeing the vibrant woman who had raised her single-handedly transform into a fragile shadow of herself. She talked about the fear that gnawed at her stomach every morning when she wondered if today would be the day she lost the only family she had ever known. Emma explained how she had stopped attending school weeks ago, unable to concentrate on math problems and book reports when her mother was fighting for her life just a few miles away. She had learned to navigate the complex hospital system, memorizing visiting hours and doctors' schedules, becoming fluent in medical jargon that should have been foreign to someone her age. She had appointed herself as her mother's advocate and protector, a role that was crushing her small shoulders under its impossible weight. Michael listened intently, his throat tightening with each detail, as memories he had buried began to surface like ghosts demanding acknowledgement. He remembered his own desperate research, staying up all night in the public library, reading about experimental treatments that were always just out of reach financially. He recalled the helplessness of watching his mother try to hide her pain behind forced smiles and optimistic words she didn't believe herself. Fighting against every instinct that told him to walk away and protect himself from the pain of involvement, Michael made a decision that would forever change the trajectory of all their lives. He helped Emma to her feet with hands that were surprisingly gentle for someone known in business circles for his ruthless negotiations and cold calculations. He suggested they speak privately about her mother's condition, leading her to a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria where they could talk without interruption. In the relative privacy of a corner booth, Emma explained how she had been essentially caring for her mother alone since Sarah had become too weak to work or manage their household. Her father had abandoned them when she was 6 years old, disappearing one morning with nothing more than a note saying he couldn't handle the responsibility of a family. Sarah's relatives lived thousands of miles away in Puerto Rico, unaware of their desperate situation because Sarah had been too proud to admit how dire their circumstances had become. Emma described the experimental CAR T-cell therapy with the knowledge and precision of someone who had spent countless hours researching every possible option for her mother's specific type of leukemia. She explained how the treatment involved extracting her mother's own immune cells, genetically modifying them in a laboratory to better recognize and attack cancer cells, then reinfusing them back into her bloodstream to hopefully cure the disease that was slowly killing her. Time was running out with terrifying speed, Emma explained with a maturity that broke Michael's heart. The doctors had given them perhaps 3 days before Sarah would be too weak to undergo the rigorous treatment protocol that represented their last hope for survival. Emma had sold everything of value they owned, had spent weeks standing outside grocery stores and churches asking strangers for help. But $1,800 was all she had managed to gather despite her tireless efforts. As Emma spoke with a courage that seemed impossible for someone so young, Michael found himself transported back to his own childhood trauma with a vividness that took his breath away. He remembered the helplessness that felt like drowning, the desperate searching for miracles that never materialized, the way hope could transform into devastating despair in the space of a single conversation with a doctor or insurance representative. But this time, Michael realized with growing determination he had the power to change the outcome completely. This time, he could be the miracle that a desperate child needed more than anything else in the world. The decision wasn't easy or simple. Opening his heart to this family meant risking the emotional walls he had carefully constructed over the years, meant potentially experiencing again the kind of pain that had nearly destroyed him as a child. Michael excused himself and immediately contacted Dr. Jennifer Walsh, one of the country's most renowned pediatric oncologists and a personal friend from his undergraduate days at Northwestern University. Within an hour, Dr. Walsh had reviewed Sarah's case remotely through the hospital's electronic medical record system and confirmed that she was indeed an ideal candidate for the experimental CAR T-cell therapy that could potentially save her life. The treatment was cutting edge, Dr. Walsh explained during their phone conversation, involving genetically modifying the patient's own immune system to fight cancer more effectively than traditional chemotherapy. The success rates were promising but not guaranteed, and the treatment carried significant risks that the family would need to understand and accept before proceeding with the expensive protocol. Meanwhile, Michael arranged an urgent meeting with Dr. Richard Stone, Chicago General's Stern Director of Operations, who was known throughout the medical community as an inflexible administrator who followed hospital protocols to the letter, regardless of circumstances or human suffering. Dr. Stone's corner office on the 7th floor was decorated with awards and certificates that spoke to his administrative efficiency, but revealed nothing about his capacity for compassion. Michael's initial request for expedited treatment based on a promised payment was met with cold, immediate rejection that seemed almost rehearsed in its delivery. Dr. Stone insisted that the hospital's policies existed for good reason and that making exceptions, even for tragic cases involving children, would set a dangerous precedent that could financially destroy the institution. The confrontation between Michael and Dr. Stone escalated quickly, their voices rising as fundamental philosophies clashed in the sterile administrative office. Dr. Stone argued that the hospital had financial responsibilities to its shareholders and employees and couldn't operate on promises or emotional appeals, no matter how compelling the circumstances might appear. He had seen too many families make commitments they couldn't keep, he explained with bureaucratic detachment, leaving the hospital to absorb massive losses that ultimately affected their ability to serve other patients. Michael's growing frustration was evident as he realized that bureaucratic inflexibility might cost Sarah her life, despite his complete willingness and ability to pay for her treatment immediately. He offered to wire the full amount that very afternoon, but Dr. Stone demanded official bank verification that could take up to 3 business days to process through the hospital's financial systems. While Michael worked tirelessly to navigate the hospital's administrative maze, Emma sat beside her, mother's bed in room 314, holding Sarah's increasingly frail hand and whispering words of encouragement that she hoped her mother could hear. Sarah had been drifting in and out of consciousness more frequently over the past week, her skin pale and translucent, her breathing shallow and labored in a way that terrified Emma more than any nightmare she had ever experienced. The room was filled with the constant sound of medical equipment, monitors beeping rhythmically, oxygen machines humming softly, IV pumps clicking as they delivered medications that seemed to provide little relief from Sarah's suffering. Emma had memorized every sound, every pattern, every change that might indicate improvement or decline in her mother's condition. Sarah stirred occasionally, asking weakly about Emma's day at school, with a voice that sounded like autumn leaves rustling in the wind. Emma would smile brightly and tell elaborate stories about imaginary lessons and playground adventures, desperate to preserve some normalcy in their shattered world and protect her mother from the additional burden of knowing that her daughter had sacrificed her education to become a full-time caregiver and advocate. As evening approached and the hospital began to quiet down for the night shift, Michael returned to Emma with carefully controlled optimism that he hoped would provide some measure of comfort. He had managed to secure a provisional approval for Sarah's treatment, pending immediate payment verification that would hopefully be completed within 24 hours. Dr. Walsh had agreed to arrive first thing in the morning to begin the preliminary procedures, but there was still the matter of Dr. Stone's rigid requirements and bureaucratic inflexibility. Emma listened to Michael's explanation with a mixture of hope and confusion that played across her young features like shifting clouds. She couldn't understand why this stranger was helping them, what he could possibly gain from involving himself in their tragedy when he could easily walk away and return to his comfortable life. When she asked him directly, her eyes searching his face for answers, Michael hesitated, struggling to put his complex motivations into words that wouldn't burden her with his own painful history. He eventually told her that sometimes people help others simply because they have the ability to do so, because it's the right thing to do when faced with suffering that could be prevented. But Emma, despite her young age, sensed there was something much deeper and more personal behind his unexpected kindness, something that connected him to their situation in ways she couldn't yet understand but could feel, in the way his voice softened when he spoke about her mother's condition. Dr. Jennifer Walsh arrived at Chicago General just after dawn, her reputation as one of America's most innovative oncologists preceding her through the hospital corridors. As she reviewed Sarah's medical files, her expression grew increasingly serious. The leukemia had progressed aggressively, and Sarah's window for successful treatment was narrowing with each passing hour. Dr. Walsh explained to Michael and Emma that while the CAR T-cell therapy offered genuine hope, it also carried significant risks that they needed to understand completely. The experimental treatment would involve extracting Sarah's T-cells, genetically modifying them in a specialized laboratory to better recognize and attack cancer cells, then reinfusing them back into her bloodstream. The process could trigger severe side effects including high fevers, organ dysfunction, and dangerous immune reactions. Some patients experienced what doctors called a cytokine storm, where the immune system became overactive and potentially life-threatening. Dr. Walsh was honest about the 50-50 survival rate, but emphasized that without the treatment, Sarah had virtually no chance of recovery. Emma listened to every word, with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone her age. She asked detailed questions about each phase of the treatment, wanting to understand exactly what her mother would endure. Michael watched this remarkable child handle information that would overwhelm most adults, recognizing in her determination the same fierce love that had driven him to desperate measures 32 years earlier. Dr. Stone finally approved the treatment initiation after Michael's payment verification cleared, though his demeanor remained cold and procedural. He made it clear that the hospital's responsibility ended with providing the medical care, regardless of the outcome. Michael found himself wondering how someone could work in healthcare while maintaining such emotional detachment from human suffering. The first phase of treatment began immediately. Medical technicians wheeled Sarah to a specialized unit where her T-cells would be harvested through a process similar to dialysis. Emma wanted to be present for everything, but Dr. Walsh gently explained that some procedures required sterile environments where visitors weren't permitted. During these separations, Emma would pace the waiting room like a caged animal, unable to focus on anything except the passage of time. Michael found himself becoming Emma's unofficial guardian during these long hours of waiting. He brought her meals from the hospital cafeteria, helped her with homework assignments she had missed, and listened as she shared memories of better times with her mother. Emma told him about Sarah's job as a seamstress, how she would work late into the night to make ends meet, always ensuring Emma had everything she needed, even if it meant Sarah went without. As they spent more time together, Michael began sharing carefully edited versions of his own childhood experiences. He told Emma about growing up in similar circumstances, about the fear and uncertainty that came with having a seriously ill parent. He didn't reveal the full extent of his own loss, not wanting to burden her with additional worry, but his empathy was genuine and comforting. 3 days later, Sarah's modified T-cells were ready for reinfusion. The procedure itself was relatively simple, but the aftermath would determine everything. Dr. Walsh warned them that the next 72 hours would be critical, as Sarah's body would either accept and benefit from the treatment or reject it with potentially devastating consequences. Emma insisted on staying in the hospital around the clock, sleeping in waiting room chairs and surviving on cafeteria sandwiches. Michael surprised himself by remaining equally vigilant. He had cleared his calendar indefinitely, something that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. His business associates couldn't understand his sudden absence from important meetings and negotiations, but Michael found that nothing seemed as important as being present for this family's crisis. On the second day after treatment, Sarah developed a dangerous fever that spiked to 104 degrees. The medical team worked frantically to control her body temperature while monitoring her vital signs for any indication of organ failure. Emma was terrified, watching through the glass partition as doctors and nurses surrounded her mother's bed with urgent efficiency. Michael held Emma's hand as she cried, promising that everything would be all right while privately fearing the worst. The little girl, who had been so brave, so determined throughout this ordeal, finally broke down completely. She sobbed against Michael's chest, apologizing for not being strong enough, for not having more money, for every perceived failure that had brought them to this moment of crisis. During Sarah's most critical hours, Michael made a decision that surprised even him. He contacted his attorney and instructed him to draft papers making him Emma's legal guardian should the worst happen. He couldn't explain this impulse to protect a child he had known for less than a week, but the connection felt as natural as breathing. Perhaps it was his way of honoring the memory of his own mother, or perhaps Emma had simply awakened emotions he thought he had lost forever. The fever finally broke on the third morning, and Sarah's vital signs slowly began to stabilize. Dr. Walsh cautiously expressed optimism, explaining that Sarah's body appeared to be accepting the treatment without the severe complications they had feared. Over the next several days, her blood work showed gradual improvement, and the abnormal cells that had been multiplying uncontrollably began to disappear. As Sarah regained consciousness and strength, she was overwhelmed by Michael's generosity and couldn't understand why a stranger would make such sacrifices for her family. Michael struggled to articulate his motivations, eventually sharing the painful truth about his own childhood. He told Sarah about losing his mother at Emma's age, about the helplessness and guilt that had shaped his entire adult life, and about seeing Emma's courage as an opportunity for redemption he never thought he would have. 2 weeks later, Sarah was strong enough to be discharged from the hospital. Her hair was beginning to grow back in soft wisps, her complexion had returned to a healthy glow, and her eyes sparkled with life that had been absent for months. Dr. Walsh declared the treatment a remarkable success, though Sarah would require regular monitoring and follow-up care for years to come. Michael offered Sarah and Emma temporary residence in a furnished apartment he owned across town. The space was bright and welcoming, with large windows that filled the rooms with natural light. Emma hadn't realized she had missed during their months of hospital visits and medical appointments. For the first time in nearly a year, Emma had her own bedroom, complete with books, art supplies, and toys that Michael had thoughtfully purchased. Sarah was determined to regain her independence as quickly as possible, but Michael encouraged her to focus on recovery while he handled their immediate needs. He arranged for home healthcare visits, nutritious meal delivery, and transportation to medical appointments. Despite his wealth, he was careful not to overwhelm them with excessive generosity, understanding that maintaining dignity was important to their healing process. As the weeks passed, their unusual family dynamic grew stronger and more natural. Michael discovered a paternal instinct he never knew he possessed, helping Emma with homework, teaching her to cook simple meals, and listening to her dreams about becoming a doctor someday. Sarah watched this bond develop with gratitude and growing affection for the man who had saved not just her life, but given her daughter a father figure she had never had. Inspired by their experience and his own journey toward emotional healing, Michael decided to establish a foundation dedicated to helping families facing medical crises they couldn't afford to address. He named it the Elena Harrison Foundation in honor of his mother, whose memory had haunted him for 3 decades but now felt like a source of purpose rather than pain. Sarah insisted on being involved in the foundation's work, despite Michael's protests that she should focus on maintaining her health. Her first-hand experience as both a patient and a mother facing impossible choices made her an invaluable advocate for families navigating the healthcare system. She helped develop programs that addressed not just financial needs, but also emotional support, childcare during treatment, and housing assistance for families traveling for specialized care. The Foundation's first official case was remarkably similar to Sarah's situation. A single father whose 8-year-old son needed experimental treatment for a rare form of brain cancer. Michael and Sarah worked together to coordinate care, covering medical expenses, while ensuring the family maintained their dignity throughout the process. Watching another child's life being saved filled both Michael and Sarah with a sense of purpose that transcended their personal healing. 6 months after Sarah's treatment, the foundation held its inaugural fundraising gala at one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels. Sarah, now fully recovered and radiant in an elegant dress Michael had helped her choose, addressed the gathering of potential donors and supporters. She spoke about the terror of facing a child's desperate hope with empty pockets, about the miracle of unexpected kindness, and about the responsibility that comes with second chances. Michael also addressed the crowd, his voice strong but emotional, as he shared his story of loss and redemption. He explained how a 10-year-old girl's courage had taught him that true wealth came not from accumulated assets, but from the connections we build and the lives we touch. The response was overwhelming, with donations and pledges of support exceeding even Michael's ambitious goals. As the evening wound down, Michael, Sarah, and Emma stood together on the hotel's outdoor terrace, looking out over the city lights that twinkled like stars. Emma, now 11 and taller than she had been during their darkest days, squeezed between her mother and Michael, feeling completely safe and loved for the first time in her young life. Sarah had officially joined Michael's life not just as the foundation's director, but as his partner in every sense. Their relationship had grown naturally from shared purpose to genuine love, built on mutual respect and understanding of life's fragility. Emma delighted in having a father who helped with homework, attended her school plays, and never missed an opportunity to tell her how proud he was of her strength and kindness. That night, as they returned to what had become their shared home, Michael lit a candle beside the photograph of his mother that he had kept hidden for years. For the first time since her passing, he spoke to Elena's memory without pain, telling her about the family she had helped him find and the purpose she had helped him discover. He finally understood that his mother's legacy lived, not in his grief, but in his capacity to prevent others from experiencing the same loss. Emma, now thriving in school and pursuing her dream of studying medicine, often volunteered at the foundation's events. She would speak to other children facing medical crises, offering them hope and practical advice about navigating hospital bureaucracies and staying strong for their parents. Her maturity and compassion impressed everyone she met, and she had become the foundation's most effective spokesperson. The Elena Harrison Foundation grew rapidly, helping hundreds of families access life-saving treatments they couldn't otherwise afford. Michael had discovered that his business acumen translated perfectly to charitable work, and he threw himself into expanding their reach and impact. Sarah's intuitive understanding of patient needs and Michael's strategic planning created a powerful combination that transformed their regional foundation into a national model. As winter arrived in Chicago, Michael reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. A year ago, he had been a successful but emotionally isolated man, driven by ghosts he couldn't escape. Now he was part of a loving family, leading meaningful work that honored his mother's memory while creating hope for countless others. Dear listeners, we hope that Michael, Sarah and Emma's story has touched your hearts as deeply as it has moved us. Their journey reminds us that sometimes our greatest pain can become our most powerful purpose, and that love truly can triumph over even the darkest circumstances. If this story has inspired you, please Please subscribe to our channel for more uplifting tales of courage, hope, and the incredible power of human kindness. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share your thoughts in the comments below. We bring you new stories of triumph and transformation every day, and your support helps us continue sharing these important messages of hope. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey, and we can't wait to hear from you.